seeing that ye are eagerly bent upon it, I will not oppose your wishes, so as not to utter everything as much as ye desire. To thee in the first place, Isle, will I describe thy mazy wanderings, which do thou engrave on the recording tablets of thy mind. When thou shalt have crossed the stream that is the boundary of the continents, to the ruddy realms of morn where walks the sun, having passed over the roaring swell of the sea, until thou shalt reach the Gorgonian plains of Sistine, where dwell the Phorcides, 3 swan-like aged damsels, that possess one eye in common, but have but a single tooth, on whom ne'er doth the sun glance with his rays, nor the nightly moon. And hard by are 3 winged sisters of these, the snake-tressed Gorgons, a horde of mortals, whom none of the human race can look upon and retain the breath of life. This week in new releases, If Looks Could Kill by Julie Berry, author of All the Truth That's in Me and Lovely War, takes a leaf out of Victorian penny dreadfuls and Greek mythology as she pits Medusa against Jack the Ripper. This is being released on September 16th, and we're here with Ms. Berry herself to discuss her inspirations and aims of the story of what it takes for women to survive in a world set against them. And if I may turn off my anchor voice for a moment, the following podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The views and opinions expressed therein are solely those of the speakers. And additionally, this podcast will include discussions of violence against women and misogyny in general, which will include discussions of sexual assault. We will also be discussing religion, murder, and the current political climate, so listener discretion is advised. Welcome to A Niche Retelling, the podcast where we explore all the ways old tales are made new. I'm your host, Jasmine Garcia, and we have a very special guest today. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Miss Berry?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jasmine, for having me here. Mm-hmm. I'm Julie Berry. I'm the author of a bunch of books for teens, for middle graders, for kids. We're here to talk about a teen title, of course. My teen titles tend to be crossover. I'm probably known for Lovely War, The Passion of Dulce, All the Truth That's in Me, The Scandalous Sisterhood of Prickwillow Place. And I'm here to talk to you about If Looks Could Kill today. Other things to know about me, I am a mom of 4 boys. I'm the youngest of 7 kids, 6 girls and a boy.
Oh, wow.
And I own an independent bookstore in my hometown, which is so fun. So that's the other cool fact about me.
Living the dream there, basically. I think most of my audience and even the people who frequent this podcast would agree. You're kind of living the dream there.
It really is fun.
Yep, and would you like to tell our audience a little bit about If Looks Could Kill then?
Absolutely. So If Looks Could Kill is a historical thriller that mashes mythology and true crime together. It is Medusa versus Jack the Ripper, and it is a wild ride. I had so much fun pitting these 2 sort of titans together, and I can't wait to, delve into it more, especially the whole retelling aspect of it. I'm excited about that aspect of your focus because there were some very deliberate choices I need to make in this retelling. And I'm excited to talk about those.
Yes, there are some really interesting routes you went with Medusa's portrayal in this. So let's kind of start with that. And this isn't your first time toying with Greek mythology, given your 2019 release, Lovely War. What would you say was different about the process of writing Medusa versus the various Greek gods that feature in that? Especially since from reading it, you could definitely say that Medusa takes a much more hands-on approach with the mortals.
Yes, absolutely. So, when I've said to people, Medusa versus Jack the Ripper, I've had 1 or 2 people look at me and say, well, obviously Medusa, instant stone. What else is there to say? And I get that. And it's always interesting to me because, I feel like when we're going to write about myths, there's a certain respect that we owe to their origins, that we owe to the original. But then what is the original? The more that I study mythology, the more that I realize that these myths have evolved, have morphed, have been told in so many ways, even in antiquity, never mind modern times. So myths are kind of these gossamer things. They're kind of like clouds. You cannot pin them down. And I don't mean to say that means anything goes. I mean, I guess creatively anything does go. I do try to walk that line of really respecting the sources, but also giving myself the creative freedom to mold those myths to meet the needs of the stories that I am writing in 2024 or 2025, right? So where Medusa is concerned, I realized early on that I wanted to make some very strategic changes. And again, when people are like, well, that's not the original myth, the question is, well, what do you even mean is the original myth? Percy Jackson? I mean, something you read as a kid? Like, unless you're a PhD in mythology, which I am not, but my sister is, I don't know that anyone even can begin to say, like, what's the original story? And my sister would say, there kind of is no original story. That said, what do we think we know about Medusa? By Athena, she was a beautiful young priestess in Athena's temple. Depending on how you interpret the story, she was either sexually assaulted by Poseidon or she had a consensual, encounter with Poseidon. But if we take the, sexual assault interpretation, which is the more common one, she is punished for what was done to her, turned into a hideous monster, and the sight of her, wreaks instant death by turning into stone, or at least by petrification, which is usually interpreted to mean turning into stone. So I think that the Medusa story is so resonant because women can see themselves in all of these acts, like unwitting victim of assault, nothing that they could do to prevent it, and then further punished for having been assaulted totally unfairly, punished by an older woman, that sort of like very unhealthy trope of the older woman jealous of the younger woman, rendered utterly silent and voiceless. You cannot have a conversation with her because you look at her and you're stone. And she's powerless to control her power. I mean, she's super powerful, but she's also a victim of its power because it makes her a curse and a byword, renders her unfit for human company. And there's nothing she can do about that, which I think speaks to, we've talked about victim blaming, right? We've talked about rape culture. We've talked about older woman, younger woman jealousy and that whole like story trope. But we also need to talk about like modesty culture, right? The idea that girls and women have a power that they cannot even control. Their bodies are a power that they can't control unless they hide their bodies. And men are innocent victims of the power that women wield. Boys will be boys. Whatever men do in response to the appearance of a female, they cannot be blamed for. And so that whole like modesty, rape culture, yuckiness is distilled in Medusa, who cannot control the effect her appearance has on others. And on, all the way down to like the divine sanction of murder, the divine sanction of murdering a woman, and the heroic glow we put around murdering a woman, and just the idea that an ugly woman is a monster. The scariest monster is an angry, ugly woman. So like, there's just so many layers of wrong in this story. And they are both the reason why women see themselves in Medusa, but they're also the reason why the Medusa myth has been so, everything in the story normalizes what happens to Medusa. She deserves it. Obviously, she should be murdered. Not even a question. It's normalized. Nothing in the story problematizes what happens to Medusa. So it's taken modern retellings to say, hey, wait a minute. And so I decided early on, and I knew, I'm going to run into some people who are like, wait a minute, what? You changed Medusa? How? Huh? Like you broke the rules. Hey, I make the rules, right? but I made some choices that my Medusas were going to be able to modulate the effect that they have. They were going to be able to actually Medusa on and Medusa off. They were going to be able to, it would take some time to learn how to use that control, but they would be able to choose when they look normal and choose when they go Medusa. Or as I like to call it, and I got trademark on this, I mean, not literally, but I hashtag Medusify, because I want women to Medusify. I want women to claim their power and own it as an empowering thing, not as a curse, right? So in my story, many women can be Medusa. Medusa becomes like a title rather than a name. It's something they can turn on and off once they've figured it out a little bit. And its effects, they can control the level of effect. And so I decided early on that I was going to really lean in to the fact that we have two meanings for petrify, one being to turn to stone and one being to terrify. Because at the root of all this was this question, what if women had the power to physically retaliate against male oppression and assault. It all comes down to the physical imbalance, right? That's what it all comes down to. And so, what if women had the power? How would they use it? Would they go around exterminating the men who hurt women? It was fun to think about that for a minute, but I quickly realized no, I don't think that's generally how it would go. I think women would use such power differently and would exercise justice and even retaliation differently. And so that required more psychological methods. But that's not to say that I took away the other petrification.
No.
Oh no, oh no. In other words, I wanted women to have something truly fearsome, something they could command and control, and something that did not prevent them from being autonomous agents with voices and freedom of movement in the real world. And so that is how we get to the way Medusa works in the retelling of If Looks Could Kill.
Yeah, no, and I kind of really loved how it almost feels like how some characters will stumble upon becoming werewolves almost, except, in this case, they have a lot more control than your average werewolf story. It really does feel like you're kind of stepping into the shoes of giants when you're trying to tackle a story like this. I've actually felt that myself. I've actually played Medusa in a TTRPG. There's even a video out there. Done makeup tutorials of what I did for my look there.
Ooh.
I have a great affection for this story for all the reasons you listed, really. And I'm actually trying to write something of my own where it's also kind of Medusa as protector, because I do think a lot of women have kind of started taking her on as like a talisman against everything you mentioned, basically.
She resonates so strongly, and yet, oh my goodness, the damage, right? And how do we reconcile that? Well, we reconcile it by reclaiming it.
Exactly. It's only recently I feel like we've been generally talking about, hey, she's not just some monster. She was a woman who was wronged and wronged multiple times over. One of the fun things about this podcast is seeing how different people take these different figures. No two people are going to tell the exact same story with these characters. So with that in mind, what is your connection to the myth of Medusa?
It's funny. Somebody said to me oh, because of your hair, right? It's like, what? But I have had kind of snaky curls my whole life, I guess. But I think, my connection is probably that of anybody who loves stories, loves myths, grew up reading them. I grew up with this Reader's Digest collection of stories for kids, and it had a lot of stories drawn from mythology. And this was, of course, pre-Harry Potter, pre-Percy Jackson. So these were just, somebody writing a, 2,000-word retelling for Reader's Digest for $75, right? But I grew up on this stuff, and I read it over and over and over again. And I loved fairy tales. And, of course, in college, I took some mythology classes and really fell in love with Ovid and, Homer, and read, as a very young mom, home with two little babies, I listened to the Odyssey and to the Iliad. And so, just kind of keep on swimming in this water, keep on diving in. And I think she just called to me in that way. I was, for this project, as I set out to write it, thinking about wanting to stay in mythic territory, but not wanting to do what I had done with the gods in Lovely War. Not that I didn't love it. I absolutely loved writing Lovely War. I had such a blast, but I never want to write the same book twice. I always want to try something new, challenge myself in new ways.
Course.
So I thought it was monster time.
Absolutely. And especially when it comes to just tackling the female characters in Greek mythology. I recently read Pandora's Jar. I don't know if you've heard of that one, where it basically just dissects various portrayals of these characters, because the ancient Greeks did not typically like women very much.
No, they did not.
Even more so than average, which is saying something about the past when it comes to the past.
Yeah, it was, it's problematic. And of course, we're talking about thousands of years ago, but Greek women were utterly silenced and utterly homebound and utterly subservient and had no voice in politics or civic life or even in a whole lot of religious life. So yeah, it shouldn't surprise us that the stories arising from that culture would reflect those ideas. And yet we still also get some really fierce and powerful women in the myth, which suggests to me that there were some individual women in the lives of, the poets producing these stories that gave them what for. So
No culture is a monolith, not even back then. Like, there's only so much we know about, the ancients, but at the end of the day, people have always been people.
For sure. You can't entirely muzzle an entire half the population, no matter how you try.
Definitely not. You did argue in your afterword of this novel that Jack the Ripper has been so mythologized that he might as well be a public domain character at this time. So what's your connection to what is arguably the first known serial killer then?
Yeah, Jack the Ripper. I mean, there again, he's huge, right? He is a tourist industry in his own right. He's massive. He exists in the public imagination in a way that no other serial killer has, even though there are others that are household names. But, I think as a person who loves Victorian literature and who loves the Victorian era and who loves British literature, you just can't help being fascinated by the story of Jack the Ripper. And really what he was the first serial killer to have this moniker and have this basically media campaign in an age where newspaper reading was really on the rise and urban crowding and poverty were really on the rise. The sensationalism of Jack the Ripper, certainly, his murders were horrific and salacious in that they were, believed to be women who were prostitutes as his victims. And that's a whole complicated thing. That's all true. But a big part of the morbid fascination with the story was how it uncovered the squalor and filth and desperate poverty of the slum neighborhoods where he plied his murderous trade. So all these things combined, right? We're sort of on the eve of the progressive era reforms, where we're starting to look at urban poverty. And it was probably a newspaper reporter who coined the term Jack the Ripper, although it might have been him because there was like Saucy Jack in a letter that maybe he wrote to the authorities, or maybe it was a fraud. In any case, he just had this clever name and he just took off. And he, newspapers were writing about him 3 times a day. So I don't know that I have an especially personal connection to him any more than anyone else who's fascinated by a great story and about how life is so much stranger than fiction.
Yeah, and it is worth noting this was also around the time Penny Dreadfuls were becoming really popular. It was basically like a Penny Dreadful had come to life on London streets, basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, what was your process in weaving together not just Medusa and Jack stories, but the stories of just these ordinary people in late 19th century New York City in a single narrative? Because, there is a lot packed into this little novel, and it is really impressive that it does come together.
Well, thank you so much. So the 2 main characters of the novel are Tabitha Woodward and Pearl Davenport. And they are 2 young women from the northeastern United States who've ended up in New York City as volunteer soldiers in the fairly new, fairly young Salvation Army that had set up outposts in the Bowery and in other areas of New York City, trying to bring a ministry of Christian salvation to the urban poor. Now, I want to be clear that they were not only, preaching a message, but also, providing meals and providing sanitation and healthcare and really working to meet human needs. And it was during this exact period of time that the Salvation Army was working so hard to try to uplift people that were desperately poor, trying to address alcoholism in a society where, people paid in liquor sometimes and where drinking was just out of control. And there were, wives and children at home had no recourse when the provider of the family drank his entire paycheck on Friday night, right? Just all these problems. So these Salvation Army workers were, religiously motivated, but as they got down on the ground trying to help actual people, they very quickly realized, they've got to have food. They've got to have air to breathe. And these tenements are so crowded, have no windows, no ventilation. People are suffocating to death literally in their apartments. Children are choking to death in their sleep because the air is so bad. And on and on and on. So out of this, we get this organizations like the Salvation Army starting to evolve into more human service organizations. And I think it's really commendable what they did, and it's really commendable what they tried to do. And they weren't the only ones, but they were, leading the vanguard of efforts. And another thing that was significant about them is that they gave women equal footing with men. At least theoretically, women had the same voice, same leadership, same opportunities to preach. And that was pretty unprecedented in either European or American Christianity at the time. So when I was trying to figure out like who will be my characters, who will be my main characters that will follow on this adventure, I was trying to figure out like how do I write about this climate, the Bowery, vice and crime and gangs of New York vibe. When I hit upon the Salvation Army, I thought, okay, now here's something I can really sink my teeth into, because I think that combination of religion and human services and like early feminism, early temperance movements, all this stuff just felt like a really fertile mix of tensions that I could work with and that I could see placing young women in believably. Whenever you want to write about young women in historical times, you've got to figure out like how much scope do they actually have? How much freedom of movement? How much could they speak for themselves? How much could they do for themselves in an age where girls were very, sheltered and supervised? So Tabitha Woodward is our more main character, more focal point character. And she has come from Troy, New York, where she was sort of, prosperous upper middle class girl. She kind of burst out in a little spat of rebellion and joined the Salvation Army and came to the city. And there she met Pearl Davenport, who is really much more like strictly religious, pious, judgmental, uptight. And where Tabitha had really hoped to make a new bosom friend, she finds she's, been paired with a prickly cactus. And so these two just do not get along. They fight, fight, fight. And I think if there's something I'm really proud of about this book, it's the relationship between Pearl and Tabitha and how I feel like they very authentically clash and collide in ways that feel real, that aren't just like, okay, we're going to have girls fight about a boyfriend or something stupid like that. But as we get to know them better and as we get to know Pearl better, we soon realize there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. And we realize we have to think twice. It's very easy to dismiss a character if she seems kind of rigidly religious, judgmental, narrow-minded. It's very easy to just like toss her to the curb, but there's something going on there. And we need to understand why. And I hope that readers will be as intrigued as I was when Pearl sort of shared more of herself with me.
Yeah, I'll admit, as somebody who is not religious and has indeed kind of encountered some issues with exactly the kind of religious person that Pearl is, I was a little bit on the edge of my seat here. It's just like, oh, am I going to hate this character? But I did come to have quite a bit of affection for her, especially as we go further into her psychology, especially as we, I don't want to go too deep into spoilers, but a couple of secrets about her are revealed. And I'm just like, okay, this is somebody who, God, if she lived in the modern era, I would desperately want her to get some good therapy.
Yes, indeed.
And, it is something that does happen with a lot of people who are especially raised in very stern religious ways, I think. It's hard for them to kind of grapple with the reality, which is often a lot more complicated, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that oftentimes in a world so lacking in things you can safely sink your pillars into, right? Lacking in firm, stable foundations, people are going to look for what foundation feels stable and secure to them. And for many people, faith provides that.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to say that means that faith is all bogus or anything like that. That's not my argument at all.
Oh, no.
But I think that it's so easy. I feel like television and films do this a lot. It's so easy to just like treat people who have any religious belief at all as though they're just gullible morons without taking a look at the buckets that religion fills for some people, right? Those needs for connection, those needs for answers, those needs for community, those needs for just like good counsel, right? And I think that we overlook that to our great detriment, especially where religion is playing such an outsized role in our civic discourse today and in laws that are changing. We can't just have like a simplistic stick figure shallow understanding of why people are drawn to this stuff. We need to understand why, and we need to understand how it has evolved to have the kind of power it has.
Absolutely. So. Yeah, like the way I see it, as long as you have faith and you're not hurting anybody with it, then we're fine. That's awesome. And I actually love having civil discussions with people who are religious because I really wasn't raised that way. And I do feel like I learned something. But again, it has to come with mutual respect there, I feel like. And it definitely makes a lot more sense why the Salvation Army was so heavily featured, because unfortunately it has come into a lot of controversy recently because while I'm sure that a lot of people who work with it, them's intentions are good. There are a lot of people who unfortunately use it to uphold their prejudices, which you even mentioned is not new, unfortunately, in the afterword.
Right, right. I mean, we always have to be careful. I've been listening to this lecture, this book written by C.S. Lewis as a scholar of medieval
Right.
literature, not as C.S. Lewis, the Narnia guy. Same guy, but but like
Yes,
his
of course.
academic work, right? And
The man will wear many hats.
he talks about the persistent problem we have in our understanding of the past and the narratives we tell about the past, in that we cannot separate our knowledge of the present or the more recent past from the older past. It's very hard for us to look through the lens of what we already know about what came after and not have it color our interpretation of what came before. So I am taking no position whatsoever on anything recent having to do with the Salvation Army, because I'm talking about 1888, and I forget offhand exactly when they showed up first in the United States, but it was within the prior decade. It wasn't very long. So I'm looking at it as a moment in time, what they were trying to do when they were admittedly way more religious than they seem to be now, although they certainly haven't abandoned those roots. But yeah, it's every group is going to have its hypocrisies, its sins, so to speak, its travesties, its scandals. And I don't mean this to be like too facile, like, everybody has problems. But I think that we notice them especially when religious groups do, because they seem to have the audacity to claim some kind of moral high ground. And then there they go.
Meanwhile, they're hurting very marginalized groups. Absolutely.
Right. So we all have to be looking out for that.
The truth resists simplicity, absolutely, but I did feel like it was important to address the controversies as well, especially given most of the audience of my podcast.
Sure. Yeah, no, yeah. It's such a hot mess.
Like, one thing I do appreciate, though, is, again, there's clearly a sense of Tabitha and Pearl are never actually disrespectful to people who do not necessarily believe. Like, they are very respectful to Freda, who is a Jewish character. I was pleasantly surprised. I was genuinely pleasantly surprised of how respectful that relationship seemed to be. And even Pearl is just like, well, yes, of course, we're going to try to preach, but that's not our main goal here. What's also interesting is that in the end, it's almost Tabitha who has almost a firmer faith, even though she isn't so strict with religion, it feels like. It almost kind of reminds me, because I'm currently reading Les Mis right now, it almost kind of reminds me of a similar vibe to that, where, yes, obviously religion is a part of it, but like the text of it and using it to kind of preach, no, this is the way, isn't really the main goal. It's to, okay, how can we use this to inform us actually helping the people who need it?
Right. I think that for both Pearl and Tabitha, their faith undergoes an evolution in the course of the novel, where they begin with a more simplistic understanding of what their faith has taught them and what it means about what's right and what's wrong. Where they arrive is a much more nuanced place that hasn't like abandoned faith necessarily, but that is much more outwardly focused, much more focused on how they are called to serve a suffering world and not judge that world and not even persuade or convert that world, but try to serve it and try to serve it in the spirit of generosity and love. And I think that to me speaks to what I think are really fundamental differences between what I'll call faith and what I'll call religion. Religion was an organized thing in the world, and it's got its rituals, its words, its people, its roles, its clothing, its ceremonies. All of that is what it is. But faith can be a very personal reaching out inwardly for whatever is a source of truth, or whatever is a source of love, whatever is a source of good guidance for living well. And in that sense, I think that we all have some kind of a faith, whether that's a faith in humanistic principles, or a faith in democratic principles, or a faith in tolerance and pluralism, or just a faith in someone precious in our life whose example inspires us, right? I think in that sense, faith is this inward reaching for something more. And I hope that became more where they landed and slightly less capital R religious.
Yeah, no, I definitely felt that way by the end of the book, and I did genuinely appreciate that. I think that's something most of us can get behind, I would hope.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
No, of course. And on to something completely different, I did notice there were references to a stage adaptation of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that just kind of was sprinkled throughout the book. Can you explain why you decided to allude to that?
Yes. So, so there had been in London, not long before or during the Ripper killings, forgive me, I don't have the dates precise, there had been a series of performances of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the actor who performed the role of Jekyll and Hyde gave a performance of such staggering convincingness. I mean, he was so successful in bringing the audience with him on his transformation from a respectable physician, man of science, to this raving monster. And the way he depicted that transformation was so dramatic and so huge and so visceral that it just mesmerized London. This idea that an ordinary, respectable human being who had a eligible position in society could secretly, under dark of night, mutate into the devil himself just gripped London. And it had these ramifications, right? Like, you look around you and there's this, banker or shopkeeper, and you're like, well, who are you in the middle of the night, And so the Ripper killings began around this time. And there's speculation that these performances somehow inspired or triggered or flipped a switch in the perpetrator. And it's possibly true.
Interesting.
I believe that we know that Francis Tumblety, who is the suspect who I have cast as the Ripper in my book, I believe we know that he saw the show. Don't absolutely quote me on that. But at least we know that he loved the theater. And that this show, which was both in New York and then in London, like when he was there, like it's almost impossible that he wouldn't have seen it. I guess we can say that. And that he was like a frequent theater goer. So yeah, the way in which that story colored the imagination of London. And, obviously there's the book, there's the play, and then there are these lurid murders. I mean, it's hard not to connect the dots and say, coincidence? I don't think so.
Yes, and Pearl, even in the midst of, her own arc, kind of starts taking inspiration from it, even though she has even said, I don't do theater because I think it's a bad idea, it's immoral, but she's still kind of like, while she's kind of having her moral spiral, kind of starts thinking of that as well. So in a way, while yes, I think our Jack the Ripper is definitely taking inspiration from it within the narrative, so are our women who are fighting against him, which that's really interesting. And again, it kind of adds to the complexity of things. Also, I do want to make a note, while I was reading the afterword with all your historical notes, the fact that, technically speaking, Jack the Ripper being involved in the Lincoln assassination may not be likely, but the chances of that actually being true are not zero, kind of blew my mind.
Right? I know. This guy, so Francis Tumblety, again, we don't know who the Ripper is. He is a suspect, a credible suspect, and I cast him as my Ripper. Okay, that being said,
yes,
his life is wild. It is wacky. It is bizarre. And the books that I read, specifically one book about him plus lots of articles written by a scholar named Michael Hawley, just blew my mind. Like, this guy was such a charlatan, such a con man, such a creep.
Kind of a Victorian Dr. Oz in a way.
I mean, he was a mess. And he was good friends with John Wilkes Booth and was apprehended and interrogated and investigated, actually arrested on suspicion of being involved in the assassination plot. And no evidence could be found to conclusively prove that he was. So whether he was or not, I don't know. But I mean, they were pals.
The chances are never zero.
It's not zero. It is not zero. That is for sure.
History is crazy, and that's part of why I love delving into historical fiction like this, because usually authors like you will share historical context, and it's somehow weirder than anything we read in the book.
It's so true. I mean, I like to think I'm an imaginative person, but like, you cannot make up the weirdness of human reality. Like, I mean, I've said many times in the last, what is it now? 7, 8 years, 8, 9 years, that like, if I had written a story that looked even a smidgen like what American politics have become, it would have been rejected by every editor for being wildly implausible, farcical, impossible. Nobody would ever believe this. And I'm like,
I'm living it.
do you believe it now?
God is a hack screenwriter. I've been saying this for years.
Amen.
Yeah, like fiction unfortunately has to make sense.
Yeah, I know. We talk about like the narrative fallacy or fictional fallacy, but like I don't think we're seeing the whole point. I mean, anyway, digression.
No, for sure. Like obviously there's only so much perspective we can have, and perhaps it does make more sense if we had more perspective on it, but all the same, it gets to the point where you have to like mentally prepare yourself to look at the headlines.
Oh, I know. I have to parse it out in small chunks.
Like we have a Cards Against Humanity deck that's based off of our little podcast family, and one of them is the real world bums us out.
It's so true.
Speaking of your afterword, though, you did mention how it's not necessarily the author's job to answer the thematic questions that it posits, and it shows in how we're introduced to the idea of Medusa taking revenge against violence against men, but never really land on whether or not she should. What might you say to a reader who feels like that's a question that ought to be answered within the narrative? I'm not even sure if I agree one way or the other, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Here's what I think fiction is at its core. Fiction is a necessary counterweight to laws, rules, religious commandments. In other words, we need a world with rules and laws to guide conduct. We need that. We need an organized society where we have agreed upon rules that we will follow. We will have authorities that will enforce these rules. We will act upon these rules. Basics. Thou shalt not kill, right? No murder, blah, blah, blah. Don't steal. Tell the truth, etc. We have rules. We have laws. We have to have them. And fiction's job is to show up and say, alrighty then, let's see what happens when you put someone in a situation and these two rules both apply. You can't obey them both. What are you going to do? Mm-hmm. That is fiction at its core. Fiction is always a moral exploration of the inevitable conundra. Is that a word? I think it is. The inevitable conundra that living in a society that is rule-based and has people in it that are like wild cannons, breaking rules and creating impossible or oppressive or horrific situations. When you live in that world, you're going to be faced all the time with competing, contrasting, conflicting imperatives, both of which are righteous, let's say. Like thou shalt not kill is righteous. Protect the innocent is righteous. So what do you do when somebody is threatening the innocent and can't be stopped? Do you kill him? What do you do, right? Very simplistic example. But my point is, fiction's job is to shine a light on, just one of the myriad ways in which we wrestle with moral dilemmas constantly. And that though laws, rules, guidelines, norms are important and necessary, they also require a constant renegotiation, a constant interrogation, and a constant social negotiation of, hey, how are we together going to exist in the face of these conflicting rules, guidelines, principles? How are we going to reconcile pluralism with X, Y, or Z? How are we going to reconcile democracy with sexism? You name it. Like, and it can be big and it can be small and intimate. It can be how do two people exist in a relationship? So that is why I would say the novel cannot answer the question, because the novel cannot anticipate all the scenarios in which the question will arise. The whole point of fiction is it depends on the circumstance. And the whole point of fiction is the wrestling with the dilemma. It can't answer the question.
And the truth resists simplicity, and also you can always draw your own conclusions from fiction. I do think ideally we should be able to do so.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you'd like to discuss in terms of this novel or anything we've been talking about?
Oh, well, I appreciate that. And I'm so grateful to you for having me here. I love If Looks Could Kill so much. I love Tabitha. I love Pearl. I love all the characters. I will asterisk that and say I don't love Jack the Ripper, but I loved the creative challenge of bringing him to the page. It was very important to me to strip him of sensationalism, of mystique, of aura, of power, and show him for the cowardly, pathetic figure that he was.
Yeah, he's just kind of a sad, strange little man.
Yeah, he is. And he just, used that in disastrous ways. And I hope and believe that this book will be a useful enabler of needed conversations about female power and about female confidence. And I hope that women will find ways to Medusify and to find their inner strength. And I hope that they will find ways to work together. Because if there is one answer that the book tries to put forward, it is, we do this together. We are strong together. The oppressor will always divide us. Male power will always try to divide and isolate us. We are stronger together, and together we can confront male violence. Together we can confront misogyny. Together we can confront rape culture. And that's not to say that it will, yield at our first assault, that it will not be hard, that it will not take time, that it will not take perseverance and persistence. But together we can do this. And we need to believe that. So I guess I do maybe have a little bit of a message after all. But I also I hope that it is for others, as it was for me, just a gripping story based on real events, but also, bringing in all the myth and fantasy and fictional tools of the trade as well. I hope you'll love the characters like I did, and I hope you'll be on the edge of your seat.
It is very thematically rich and gives you a lot to think about, which is always great. Because I saw people commenting on it. It's just like, this sounds like it should be just a superhero team up, but it's so much more. I do definitely agree with that. Like, it gave me a lot to think about and then a lot to talk about, which I think is always fun for a book.
Well, thank you. Well, I loved this conversation. Thank you, Jasmine, for your wonderful questions. I'm so excited, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you for coming on. I really appreciated having this conversation as well. Is there anything else you'd like to plug before we wrap things up?
Well, I will say support your local independent bookstore. Like, really, really, really find a local independent bookstore. And even if you don't have one near you, order books from one. Many of them ship for low cost or maybe even free. Shopping local, reading local, stimulating a local billionaire free way to get access to information literally might be how we protect freedom of speech, which is certainly under attack. We cannot entrust all that we depend upon for democracy to function to powers that are too wealthy to be
held accountable,
unaccountable, and but also free from government attention and influence. Right. So never been more important than now to read, never been more important than now to shop locally, never been more important than now to support local independent businesses, bookstores, news sources. They matter tremendously.
Yeah, and even if you don't have one in your area, bookshop.org is right there that you can pick any independent bookstore to support through there. I absolutely love it. I try to get most of my books from there.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And speaking of ordering books, please do consider looking into getting a copy of If Looks Could Kill. As of the dropping of this episode, September 15th, it is still up for pre-order. It will be releasing on the 16th. Again, I really did find this book to be really interesting and thematically rich, and just a really creative concept. I think everyone should give it a try. And seriously, thank you very much to Julie Berry and her agent, Alex Kelleher, for reaching out and allowing for this cross-promotion to happen. It was really, really fun getting to read this book and to talk to you seriously. And as always, you can find me at Favorvare on all the socials, and you can find this podcast on Blue Sky and technically Twitter at IAR Podcast. To help us reach the next chapter of our story, please consider donating to our Patreon, our Ko-Fi page, or the Spread the Show link below. Or if you are unable to support us monetarily in these really financially uncertain times, please consider rating and reviewing us on the podcatcher of your choice, and spreading the word to any nerds in your life that might want to hear about us. And as you could probably see on the podcatcher, this is not the only episode we have dropping this week. We also have Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden adaptation that has just hit its 20th anniversary. So please consider giving that a listen, and remember, stories gain power in each retelling. And again, Cito Bear to Forces, the fair-cheeked grey, sisters grey from their birth, and both deathless gods and men who walk on earth call them the Grey. Prefredo well-clad, and saffron-robed Enyo, and the Gorgons who dwell beyond glorious ocean in the frontier land towards night, where are the clear-voiced Hesperides, Stheno, and Uriel, and Medusa, who suffered a woeful fate. She was mortal, but the two were undying and grew not old. With her lay the dark-haired one in a soft meadow amid spring flowers. When Perseus cut off her head, there sprang forth great Chrysaor and the horse Pegasus, who was so called because he was born near the springs of ocean, and that other because he held a golden blade in his hands. Now Pegasus flew away and left the earth, the mother of flocks, and came to the deathless gods. And he dwells in the house of Zeus, and brings to wise Zeus the thunder and lightning.